Hey, Nathan here. Welcome back to another video covering Unity2D. In the last video, we discussed how to spawn objects by a keyboard input, the space key in this example. And right now, if I play this game, and if I move my object around and hit space, it'll spawn a bullet, but the bullet will not move. And if I hold the space bar down, we discussed this in the last video, it'll only fire one bullet. It will not fire multiple bullets, no matter how long we have our space key pressed. In this video, we are going to discuss the RigidBody 2D, and the reason we're going to do this in this video is because last video I had a little bit of a sore throat, and I could not really talk that well, and hopefully the video turned out well. I think it did. But in any case, my throat is better now, and we're going to discuss the final part of the video, which I wanted to discuss last time. Okay, so the issue last time is that if we move our object and hit space, the bullet will not move. So the reason for that is we need to have a velocity in our object. You can do this manually if you want. It's not recommended, or it's not even suggested. The best thing to do is to use whatever Unity has for you. In this case, it's a RigidBody 2D. So if we go into our bullet, so I'm not playing my game, there's no bullet in my hierarchy. So I need to drag a bullet in the hierarchy, and now I can access the bullets inspector here. So I need to add a component for RigidBody 2D. RigidBody, that's for 3D games. Anything 3D has nothing indicating that it's 3D. Everything 2D has 2D in the name. Okay. So RigidBody 2D. So the basic rule of when to use a RigidBody 2D is if you have objects that move and need to participate in collision, you need a rigid body, and you also need the collider, which we'll get into in the next video. So if the objects are static, they don't move, they don't participate in the physics engine, they don't have gravity or whatever, you don't need to have rigid body. However, there's a asterisk on this rule where you see in my player, I'm controlling that through the actual transform. So this doesn't really need to have a rigid body until we need to deal with collision. And in that case, when that happens, we need to adjust the way our object moves. And we'll get into that in a future video. Okay, so you might have seen that when I play this game, watch this bullet. Go ahead and watch this bullet. When I hit play, I'm not going to touch the keyboard or anything, I'm just going to hit play. So that bullet is now descending. It's being affected by gravity, and that's due to this RigidBody 2D. It has a gravity scale of 1. We need to set that to 0. We're not going to rotate it, but I'm going to go ahead and set the angular drag to 0, and then linear drag to 0 as well. That's already set. Mass, we can leave it alone. All this other stuff, that's all advanced, and we'll get into that when we actually need to deal with, when we discuss the actual space shooter game, we'll discuss all this stuff. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this rigid body. Body type, dynamic, kinematic, or static. So dynamic means that it is being adjusted, the position is being influenced by the physics engine. We are going to give it a velocity, and then the positioning of this bullet will be affected by the physics engine. We will not directly manipulate our positioning of our bullet. Kinematic means that this object is not going to be moved based on the physics engine. It is going to be moved based on the scripts, where we set our movement based in the actual script file, similar to how we move our player by just adjusting its transform position. But we don't use the transform if it has a rigid body. We call RigidBody 2D.move position, and we'll move it to a whatever position we want. So that is what the kinematic means. And then static is just a non-moving target and, like a platform or something in the game. Material, you can have different physics materials, like different bounciness and different effects you can have for physics materials. There will be another video to discuss that. Simulated means that it's if this is not checked, it is not part of the simulation, where a few things will not happen. For example, it will not be affected by gravity and things like that. So if we set the gravity scale to 1 and uncheck this, it's not affected by gravity. It's not part of the simulation. Okay, so I'm going to set that to 0, and I'm going to check that back. Also, forces don't really influence it as well. Auto mass, that can be used. When you do that, you can't set mass directly, that kind of thing. Mass, you can set it directly. Mass will influence forces being applied to it, and that gets into physics formulas, and there'll be a whole tutorial later on to discuss physics in a more advanced topic. Linear drag and angular drag, that's just as it's moving, it might slow down if it has a drag, that kind of thing. If it's moving from the left to the right and it has a drag, it will slow down. It'll add friction to the object. And the same thing with angular drag. If it's rotating and it has angular drag, it will slow down over time. Gravity we discussed, collision detection. It's usually recommended to always use discrete unless you have problems. Then you want to use continuous. Sleeping mode, it's usually recommended to start awake. And interpolate. And that's what we'll get into as well. Okay, so that's the basic concept of rigid body. We'll discuss more of these things in depth later on in the series. But let's go ahead and apply this to the prefab, and then we can go ahead and delete this object. So what we're going to do is we have applied that to that bullet object. Now, the player is going to spawn a bullet. Now, we want to actually move the bullet when it fires. So there's one thing we need to add. We need to add another public variable to hold the bullet speed. So at the very top where we have public float speed, let's add public float bullet speed is equal to, let's say, 25. Okay, so now we have a bullet speed, and that will control how fast our bullets go. So, whenever we press the space key, it instantiates a new bullet. In order to get a reference to that new bullet, instantiate returns a game object. Let's say lowercase bullet is equal to that. So we have a reference to the newly instantiated bullet. We need to set its velocity. So bullet.getComponent RigidBody2D. So we get the RigidBody2D component, and that has a velocity variable that we can set. And we set that to new vector 2. We do not want it to move in the x direction, so we set that to 0. And we just set the bullet speed as the y component. So now we save that. And now we go back to Unity. And we play our game. Alright, so I'm going to move around. I'm going to hit space. So now our bullet is now traveling upwards because we added RigidBody2D, and all we're doing is setting the velocity. So when we set the velocity, the physics engine takes care of it because it's a RigidBody2D, and it is moving up. Okay, another thing we need to discuss in a future video. Look on the left. Look at all those bullet clones. How many bullets are on the screen? 0. So we need to find a way to clean these up, and we'll discuss that when we go into the actual space shooter game, and we'll go from there. Okay, so that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This was supposed to be on the end of the last video, but my throat was just too bad and I could not go through with the tutorial anymore. So, the next video, we're going to discuss collision. And we're going to bring in the enemy and worry about how to collide the bullet with the enemy. So, I hope to see you next time.